12 o'clock.
But I would suggest that quickly. I mean, we said 12 o'clock, so maybe a little bit 5 or 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, that's
so let me go down and I'll just send you a message that come up. Otherwise, you'll sit there for 10 minutes.
Absolutely. It'll take a while.
Yeah, so we just do this presentation.
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah.
So go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And I do look forward to Derek's seminar. It'll be quite interesting. I've got 2 presentations lined up for the day. We'll probably try and share it across time based on how long we take. Hopefully, I don't blab too long. So the first one is dealing with how we could look at knowledge management in the public sector. So I was actually, in preparing this, I was struggling with how we frame this discussion. Do we go too theoretical? Do we discuss the broad ambit of what knowledge management is about, and then how do we make it useful? Because you gotta focus what you do. So so I tried looking at what's being discussed locally about how we apply knowledge management frameworks within the country. So that's my first discussion. The second one, after lunch, I'll talk about the different data systems that we have internally within the BRICS Center. I've got 2 hats somewhat in the organization. So I work on BRICS research, but I also am involved in indicator projects which cut across the organization. So there's an ongoing project on there where we're trying to visualize our data, and the progress that we make there will then benefit you as well. And then lastly, I'll touch on some of the type of services we can provide with web development. We have a web developer in the team, so he helps us put things together. Coming back to this knowledge management question. So as I said, I looked at it as what are the frameworks that we can apply here in South Africa for the Eastern Cape. And so I tried to, my background firstly is 2 years ago, I actually finished my master's in knowledge management. So that's where my theoretical understanding of it is. So that's where I'm grounded from. So I tend to understand the theory, but practically, I mean, I spoke to Ian about this a month ago. I haven't really seen these type of strategies implemented anywhere and have it been successful. So it's a sad note, but perhaps an opportunity for us as well, that there are solutions out there that we can draw on. So the content that I have here, I pulled most of it from a DPSA framework targeting knowledge management, which was actually prepared in 2005, which perhaps is quite an indictment on us that these things were out there many years ago, already dating back to 2005, perhaps before that, and we haven't really been able to leverage this successfully. So in terms of the talk that I'll give, I'll start off just discussing what knowledge management is about and try to just pin down a few key definitions that we need to consider. I look at the common challenges which affect us here locally, and then public and private sector, the same issues are pervasive. Then there's this thing about the 6 E's which come out of the theory, which is things about being efficient and effective and so on. So I touch on that, and then we look at strategy of knowledge management. So what should we be focusing on? And then particularly what should we be focusing on in the public sector? And then I come back to a key theory idea, which is the SECI model. So I explain how the SECI model is useful to us and what that actually means. Talk about some prerequisites for knowledge management, things that we need to have before we can actually kick off. Some policy issues. What do we need to frame policy around this? And then people is a big thing. People drive the knowledge management effort. Without them, if we don't invest in people, we're not going to be successful. And then I talk about explicit and tacit knowledge. And so what are the different types of solutions that we could introduce based on either of these forms of knowledge. And then we close with where do we take this? So if we have the goal of developing a learning organization, how do we get there? And then we can probably have our discussion from there. In terms of what knowledge management is about, Isaac, if you don't mind, I'll just... so I use the acronym KM around, so that's knowledge management. So the theory, what it discusses is that it's a conscious strategy of getting the right knowledge to the right people at the right time. And so in addition to that, it's also about action. So you've got to put information into action. So having information in a document might not actually be useful unless somebody can interpret the document and then do something with it. You haven't really brought in the true knowledge angle. And that's where the debate actually lies currently. Is explicit information, documents and so on, is that really knowledge? So the tacit knowledge, that's what we know. That's based on our experience. That's what we learn. But that's what's very difficult to manage. We tend not to share information between us, or we think that we need to hold on to the information because that's our competitive advantage against our own colleagues. So those are the important differences. The explicit knowledge, that's your codified information, your documents and so on, and the rules in place. So if I need to send admin a particular document in a particular format, that's knowledge in itself because there's rules behind it and there's a process that's employed. So when we're talking about the management of knowledge, we need to understand that we will have strategies for tacit knowledge and we'll have strategies for explicit knowledge, and it goes from there. And knowledge management must come from the business. So it can't be seen as an IT function. I think in my experience, where people have tried to bring this in, they see it as two separate things, something you slap on top of the organization, and whether it's successful is then it's dependent on how people actually react to it and adopt the strategies. And if business doesn't drive it and they don't see the value in it, the strategies that you introduce fail. And then underpinning this whole discussion, there's some key questions that we've got to ask ourselves. What knowledge, firstly, are we trying to manage? So what's out there? Is it available? Where is it? Who has it? So there'll be these different locales within your organization where people might know something, but does it get shared? What's holding you back? So you've got to ask these three questions, or four questions actually, as you work with this. It's important also to distinguish between records management, information management, and knowledge management. So records management, that's just the documents and stuff that flow through an organization. Your information, that's your data, your statistics. So you could have a data warehouse that's managing that, but that's somewhat separate from the idea of knowledge management. And so knowledge management speaks to management of how do I do something? What do I need to know to do that? And so how do I make sure that that type of information is shared and can be used? Common challenges that we experience. Ian and I had a discussion last month, and I felt like I started rambling off about all these different challenges because it's so common. It's common here in the HSRC. We haven't got a grasp on this either. But these are the ideas that we need to understand. So the culture, corporate culture, can hinder the free flow of information. So if the culture is not about sharing or not about learning, that in itself can then restrict you. The intellectual capital might not be coordinated. It's not externalized, and it's lost with staff turnover. So we don't have a grasp of who controls the information and what happens when people leave. Decisions, it's not traceable. We sit in meetings, we take decisions, there's minutes, what happens to the minutes? It's those type of issues. And so how do we trace the big decision that we have? How did it flow from the smaller discussions that we've had within the organization? And then a big issue is we don't know what we know. Because knowledge is tacit, it's in our heads, we don't share the information, we don't have good strategies in place on how we share this amongst us. So there's no transfer of the skill. So you might have some experts, but sitting next to the person might be somebody who could really benefit from that. But if you don't have strategies in place to share that information, it resides with one person and perhaps is lost over time. Your recruitment strategies, they're not targeted to the gaps in knowledge. Because we don't know what we know, we don't know who we need to hire to supplement what we don't know. So if we can externalize the type of information that we have, that will help us with our recruitment strategy. So we could be hiring people which duplicate skills that we need. So we need to get a handle on what we know. We might also not appreciate the knowledge and skills that we do have. Could be an issue because we don't know what's there. And then linked to that is even after capacity building, we may not be building the right set of skills. And so we continue to say our capacity is low even after we've had some initiatives to try and address that because it's not targeted correctly. And then the issue of silo mentality has come up. It's prevalent here in this organization. It's prevalent in the private sector. Wherever I've been, it exists because we try to cling to the knowledge that we have. We see that as our competitive edge over our colleagues, and it's a problem. And how do we break that down? So that's why we say these things need to be driven by the business. If it's not, IT can't solve that problem. And then conformity. We tend to reward those that stick in their bubbles because that's how the policies are structured. If you tend to go outside of your group, you get punished for that to some extent. So we need to understand why that happens and then introduce strategies to address that. So those cross-component projects, those are the ones that tend to struggle because we're not set up in a way that actually allows that and allows people to share information and so on. So we to address that, we need more integrated planning and decision making. So, and not just having board meetings and having the high level people sit together and discuss these things. We need more sophisticated ways of sharing information across teams within an organization. And what we end up doing with all these different type of challenges is that we tend to reinvent the wheel. We go through same strategies that were perhaps introduced 2-3 years ago and beyond. So we might have gone down this road, invested money in it previously, perhaps found it didn't work, but we didn't document why it didn't work. So we didn't learn from that experience. And then a few years later, you have new people in, they say, why don't we try this? And then you perhaps, if things haven't changed to a great extent, you have the same issues re-emerging. So I mean, it's not only a public sector issue. I've seen it in the banks. I've seen it elsewhere. So we're not alone in trying to solve these problems. The flip side of this is that we also tend to document too much. We want to externalize everything. When we bring people on a project, we give them a stack of information and they say, this will help you get up to speed. But then you get lost in the information. I mean, even a presentation like this perhaps is not the best way of sharing information because we're trying to squeeze everything into a few hours in the day, but are we really learning from one another in the best possible way? So you really have to think about how you set up your work processes and make sure things are in these bite-sized chunks that you can process the information is there so that you can actually take action in a meaningful way. So the strategies that we implement, this is where we come with these 6 E's. So people that write books tend to like to repeat things with the same letter, or they'll have some way of presenting it. So here they talk about being effective, efficient, economic, ethical, equitable, and excellent. So the idea of being excellent, I guess that's what we need to get to. So what we do, the strategies that we introduce, we're trying to promote learning within an organization. We're trying to learn from one another. And so what we do should be better than what we've done before. And we should be improving on that trajectory. So the question is, how do we, with what we're doing, actually improve the processes that we have? The strategy. So the strategies that we implement, then we need to move away from the conceptual and then speak about the practical. I think that's been a problem that we've seen. We tend to talk about what the theory says, but then we don't think about actual strategies that we could implement. So we need to think about what does it actually mean for us? What works? And I think where this is difficult and why people tend to struggle to do this is every organization is different. So the strategy that we implement in the HSRC will be very different from yours. I mean, when you look at the organization structure that you have many external organizations that you need to bring in on board as well. And whereas our challenges are internal and also trying to work with our stakeholders. So the strategy must be unique to your business process. And we need to move away from bureaucracies and then try and bring in more learning organization management models. So we need opportunities to be able to share information across our boundaries. And then the strategy that we implement, one, it needs to promote our capabilities. So we need to know what our strengths are. And we also need to know what our weaknesses are so that we can address them. Look at what our efficiencies and inefficiencies are. Look at what our strategic goals for this project should be. What do we see? Where do we see this going? And then link that back to the goals of service delivery. So in the province, what are we trying to do? How will this project actually affect service delivery in the end? So we need to understand that connection as well before we kick off. And then it must also promote our support networks and the resources within. So who is providing the information, who is producing the information? We need to ensure that people are connected properly and that their information reaches the right people. So right people, right knowledge, right time. It's those issues need to come together. And then what are the processes for decision making within the organization? And what information then needs to be targeted to those people? And then the strategy must also target the issue of culture, and we must also talk about the performance evaluation. It needs to be embedded in there. So if we're introducing new strategies, it needs to be measured as such. And so if we want people to engage, we need to have some sort of metrics that we can follow that's useful. We shouldn't be bringing in new bureaucracies for the sake of it, but we do need to ensure that people get recognition for the effort that they're making to share the information. And then the issues of culture, it's promoting that culture of learning and fostering the environment to promote creativity, which leads to innovation. Within the public sector, where is this relevant? So one, it needs to be linked to service delivery. We need to avoid reinventing the wheel. We need to foster a common language across us. So different units might be referring to same things with different terms. So a knowledge management strategy needs to look at what are the key issues that are being discussed, and then come up with that common language that we can use to share our insights with one another. Often insights can't be shared because we might be coming from a different background. So an economist might not be able to speak to an anthropologist. It's the language doesn't quite interface, so we need to look at those issues. We need to make new partnerships and then create connections across our department. So we need to allow people to link up and then have that partnership. We need to strengthen the relationships that we have between the different spheres. So we need to figure out what is the flow of information, who is getting it, when do they need it, and then have that working for you. And then enhance knowledge sharing related to your public and your other partner needs. So we need to share what information is useful. And then the strategy must try to maximize the potential of the individual. So based on, if we try to surface what we are producing internally, we must then promote it. So once we get a grasp of where the information is coming from, we must then maximize that information, but then also target our gaps. So in terms of one of the key theoretical insights, there's the SEKI model, which was developed by a guy in Japan called Nonaka back in '91. And so this is one of the foundational theories in knowledge management. And he talks about how knowledge can be shared. So he looks at implicit and explicit, tacit and explicit knowledge. And then we look at what are the forms of knowledge being shared. And so what are the types of strategies? So the SEKI refers to socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. So socialization the strategies that you implement is how we talk to one another or how we engage one another. So the different types of networks that we introduce will then fall under this the socialization component. Externalization is when we try to now codify the different types of knowledge that we are producing. So we may be having this discussion, but what comes of it? So we need to ensure that we have somebody together with us that's taking notes, but useful notes at that. And there's very different means of doing this. We could be recording it. We could have a video that goes online. So there's different types of tools that we could be looking at.
No one has taken any selfies, so we're using your one.
So, but all of that information is useful. But it's useful when it has a purpose in mind. So if I have a 3-hour-long recording, is that useful? But if I can condense it somehow into smaller chunks, perhaps that can be consumed more easily. Combination is where you have tools that bring together both the socialization and the externalization together. So we talk, but we do document. And so we have different types of tools that then allow you to do that. These different options are what you could look at. Then internalization perhaps maybe is the most important when it comes to learning. So we talk, we document, but do we take it in? Do we understand? Do we learn from it? And so that's what's important there.
We share it.
And can we share it? So one of the most useful ways of promoting learning and teaching is for you to be able to teach it yourself. So you've consumed it, but then can you pass it on to the next person? That's perhaps one of the best measures to see how well somebody has actually understood something. So that's where these issues come from: learning by doing, reflecting, trial and error. So we need to adopt or look at those type of things when we take it forward. When we set up the strategy, there's a few things that we need to have. So we need support from our stakeholders and our leadership. They need to drive it. So they need to understand, firstly, what we're trying to do. The capacity, we need to have resources allocated to this to help you push this along. So that's people to do it, and then a budget as well to go along with that. And it's a struggle, but it's necessary. So people need to understand the importance of this for it to become more successful. You need a team dedicated to the program as well. So it wouldn't be successful if you have somebody coming from outside trying to drive it, because they don't really understand what's going on internally. So you need to build the capacity internally for them to guide it. Perhaps that's where I guess the discussion will come. What would our role be in something like this? Because us driving it from the outside may not actually be successful. So what form of partnership do we set up to assist you in taking this forward? And then key points: knowledge management doesn't happen outside of business processes, as I mentioned earlier. And the organization must be willing to consider revising inefficient structures that are in place. So if something's not working and we find it to be as such, they need to be willing to rework it so that we can try something else and see if that fails. The first strategy you go for might not actually work, but if we do it iteratively and we try to refine it, those could improve. And we need to try to. Yeah, I'm just worried about Derek.
No, I'll wait till you finish it.
Yeah. So we need to try and infuse the knowledge management processes that we implement into all the functions and processes and procedures that were within there, but with a focus of a particular business objective. So if we want to address one problem, we need to understand all the different contributing factors to that, and then identify how knowledge management can supplement that and improve the process, so that we are codifying the right information and the right people are receiving it and internalizing it. Which then leads me to that last point: it needs to target a real business need. And when we develop the strategy, we need to be able to articulate it. We need to be able to adequately explain how this will impact a particular unit. So If we have some strategy that says we wish to introduce knowledge management in the Eastern Cape, it doesn't say who's affected, how are they affected. So it needs to be more specific. And when it comes to the setting up policies to this, we need clear career pathing. So if there are people that are going to be, if we are trying to address one particular business problem, we need to understand the different positions that are impacted. And if somebody falls off that process, they leave for whatever reason, we have a career path in mind and that we can bring people along. So if there is an expert and there are people that are shadowing that person, how do we ensure that their next person in line is being upskilled sufficiently so that they can transition into that next position. So, and then how do we then fill that gap that comes along? You bring somebody from outside to fill a position might not work because they don't understand the actual business problem, and so it takes them a while to get up to speed, and then the business may suffer. An important point which needs to be taken into consideration is exit interviews. One of the most important reasons to understand why an organization is failing is based on the discussion that leads in that exit interview, but that information needs to go somewhere. If it sits with HR and it doesn't get used, what happens? So you need the right person to lead that exit interview, and that information needs to go somewhere so it leads to a strategy. Over time, you may start to see commonalities which emerge, so that we need to now figure out how do we draw insights from what's being said there and then address the problems which are emerging. So one of the options for that is that you need a very good thought out questionnaire that asks the right questions that you're finding within the organization, which then allows you to surface these issues. And then perhaps the questionnaire, you'll have a combination of open-ended and closed-ended questions, but perhaps you can start to quantify the extent of these issues. If you do have champions within teams that are meant to lead the knowledge management function, they need to have some sort of training. They need to understand the theory behind it. SAMD, South African Management Development Institute, offers some training in this. So there are other options, but they need to be informed of what it is that they are trying to do, and training is important. I've got a spelling error there. Requisite became required. My apologies. But then you need to have agreements within the department that's introducing this, that we will try to promote those requisite skills and competencies needed to better implement the policies that we have within our department.
Can we do?
You can do that. So just but take 5 minutes because you will still settle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think there's just one or two others.
Excuse me, I'll see you.
Just we can talk about before they go to the seminar. How many more slides have you got?
Probably about 6.
It's more.
Yeah.
Can we perhaps just because we have to go down in about 15 minutes.
Sure.
I just want to we can come back to this when we come back this afternoon, but just very quickly.